Jin Wei believed betrayal had only one face. Silence. Years ago, when his ex-girlfriend vanished at the most dangerous moment of his rise, he didn't search for excuses. He reached a conclusion. She had abandoned him. She had chosen safety over loyalty. And in Jin's world, that choice was unforgivable. That belief shaped everything that came after. The empire. The ruthlessness. The man he became. But what Jin never questioned, what he never allowed himself to question, was whether silence always meant betrayal. Because the truth was far more dangerous. Her silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't fear. And it certainly wasn't regret. It was a decision. One that protected a secret so devastating that revealing it too soon would have destroyed him. And by the time Jin began to understand what her silence had really done, the damage was already irreversible. At 38, Jin Wei stood at the top of a world built on obedience and fear. His name alone could close businesses, end alliances, or erase people from the city without a trace. He wore power effortlessly, tailored suits, controlled movements, an expression that never betrayed uncertainty. He believed control was earned through distance. Emotions were liabilities. Trust was temporary. And silence, in his experience, was the clearest confession of guilt. The woman who had disappeared from his life years ago had taught him that lesson. When danger surrounded him and loyalty mattered most, she said nothing, and left him to survive alone. Or so he believed. Now, as his life moved forward with calculated precision, new alliances, public appearances, a future built on strategy, small inconsistencies began to surface. Records that didn't align. Choices she had made that no longer fit the story of cowardice he told himself. The more Jin examined the past, the more unsettling the thought became. What if she hadn't stayed silent to save herself? What if she stayed silent to save him? And what if the price she paid was far greater than anything he ever lost? Jin had always been a man who understood power, not just how to take it, but how to make people think they owed it to him. He didn't inherit anything, he built everything from the ground up. Every skyscraper he owned, every account he controlled, every whisper of fear that followed him, it all traced back to the same lesson he'd learned the hard way: trust no one, and make sure everyone thinks you gave them the choice to follow you. He liked to tell himself his rise was justified, that the world had wronged him first. He told the story like gospel: once upon a time, someone betrayed him, someone close, and it was that treachery that set him on fire. It was a story of survival, of clawing his way out of a pit that had been dug for him. But the truth, well, the truth was more complicated, though Jin didn't care to untangle it. He didn't need the truth. The story he believed, the one he fed himself over late nights in his penthouse, kept him sharp, kept him ruthless, kept him untouchable. The betrayal he recalled wasn't just a betrayal, it was a symphony of deceit that had tried to break him, and in his mind, it had succeeded. Every business deal gone wrong, every hand extended and then withdrawn, he catalogued them as proof of a world conspiring against him. And he had responded with the only weapon he knew: absolute dominance. Friends became pawns, allies became informants, enemies became cautionary tales. He built his empire on fear, yes, but more than that, on narrative. People believed the legend of Jin, the self-made king who survived the betrayal that would have killed anyone else. He remembered that night vividly. The dim light in the old office, the smell of cheap cigars and cheaper whiskey. Someone had lied to him, and the repercussions had cost him everything he'd been trying to hold on to. He had been naive, foolish, vulnerable, and he swore, then and there, that he would never be that again. Every empire needs a foundation, and his was laid in the ashes of that betrayal. But empires are delicate things. They can rise quickly, yes, but they also attract scrutiny. Jin had learned that the hard way. The people he crushed, the whispers he ignored, they never really disappeared. They lingered in hallways, in the quiet tones of boardroom conversations, in the subtle tension of those who moved through his world with cautious steps. He fed on it, though. He thrived on knowing that everyone else feared the storm he carried inside him. Fear was more loyal than any friend. Yet even with all his control, there were cracks. Gene liked to believe that his past, the betrayal that had built him, had also armored him against emotion, against distraction. But every now and then, in the quiet moments before sleep, the memory gnawed at him. Not because it had defeated him, no, that part of the story was satisfying, but because he knew he had used it as an excuse, a lens through which he justified everything. Every ruthless decision, every calculated strike, every empire-building maneuver, they weren't just survival, they were revenge against a shadow that may not even have existed in the way he imagined. And yet, in his mind, that didn't matter. It had worked. The empire was his, and the people who had wronged him were either beneath him or broken. Gene had mastered the art of narrative control. If you told the story hard enough, believed it hard enough, you could make reality itself bend to your version of events. He had become the story he wanted to be, and the world, unwillingly, had to follow along. But empires aren't just built on fear, they are maintained on vigilance. And Gene had learned that vigilance required not just power, but obsession. Every deal, every move, every whisper of treachery he suspected, even if imagined, was documented, dissected, and weaponized. His rise had been forged in betrayal, yes, but the real empire, the one that allowed him to sleep in his penthouse with a sense of invincibility, had been built on the lie he told himself, that the betrayal had truly defined him. And maybe, somewhere deep inside, he feared that if the lie ever fell apart, so would he. She had vanished without a word, leaving behind only the echo of her presence and the chaos of unanswered questions. Gene could feel it still, the emptiness she left in the spaces she once filled, the silence that now screamed louder than any confession. People whispered about her disappearance, some in sympathy, most in judgment, but none of it reached the truth. She didn't vanish because she was weak. She vanished because she understood something Gene could never admit. Sometimes survival meant walking away from the fire, not into it. Everyone assumed they knew why she left. They painted her as frightened, as fragile, as someone who couldn't stand the intensity of his world. But those were lies. Gene didn't want to hear the truth, because the truth was a threat to the story he told himself. If she had left because she saw him, not the man he pretended to be, but the man he really was, it meant that he wasn't untouchable. And Gene, above all else, needed to be untouchable. Her absence became a riddle he obsessed over. Each morning, he would walk past the empty room she had once occupied, the faint scent of her perfume still lingering like a ghost, taunting him. He didn't allow himself to mourn, not fully, but the emptiness gnawed at the edges of his control. Her silence was a weapon, even if she didn't intend it to be. By refusing to explain, by refusing to justify herself, she had handed him a mirror, one that reflected all the fractures he refused to acknowledge. The assumptions piled up around him like snow in a storm. People whispered that she had run away with someone else, that she had betrayed him the way he believed everyone betrayed him, that she had been nothing but a stepping stone in his carefully crafted empire. Gene hated those whispers, not because they wounded him, but because they forced him to consider the possibility that they might be true. And deep down, the idea that she had chosen a world without him, without his empire, without his control, was a blade pressed against his chest. Yet, despite everything, he could not erase her from his mind. Every strategy meeting, every deal, every calculated move was shadowed by the question she left dangling: why? And it wasn't just curiosity, it was fury. The fury of a man who had built everything on control, only to have a single person slip through his fingers without so much as a warning. She had exposed the one thing Gene could never master: uncertainty. He tried to replace her absence with distractions, new alliances, louder power plays, deeper schemes. But none of it filled the void. Every triumph tasted hollow, every conquest felt like a lie. She had disappeared, and in her absence, she had gained more power over him than any rival ever could. It was maddening, humiliating, and yet intoxicating in a way Jean could not admit. And still, he told himself the story he needed to survive, that her silence was betrayal. That her leaving was proof of weakness. That the assumptions everyone made were facts, and facts were all that mattered. He wrapped himself in this narrative, letting it harden around him like steel. In his mind, he could convert her disappearance into fuel for his empire. Every whisper, every rumor, every shadow of doubt became ammunition in his war against the world, and against himself. But the truth, the inconvenient, undeniable truth, remained hidden behind her absence. She had left because she had known something he would never admit. That love, loyalty, even devotion, could not exist in a world ruled by fear. That empires, no matter how towering, can crumble if they are built on lies. And that some silences are louder than any scream. So Jean carried on, plotting, scheming, conquering, all while haunted by the echo of her absence. Every decision was tinged with the ghost of what he could not control, every move shadowed by the fact that she had disappeared, leaving only assumptions, and leaving him to wrestle with the emptiness she had carved into his empire. And somewhere, buried beneath layers of rage and justification, he knew that her silence was a challenge he could never ignore. Jean had always believed that the story he told himself was unshakable, that the empire he built on betrayal and fear was bulletproof. But cracks have a way of showing themselves, no matter how carefully you plaster over the walls. It started with small things, slips in accounts, unusual movements in the shadows, whispers that didn't align with the carefully constructed narrative he fed himself. At first, he dismissed them. Everyone makes mistakes, he told himself. Even in power, small errors are inevitable. But then the inconsistencies began to multiply, and Jin's instinct sharpened into something dangerous, suspicion. He couldn't name the moment it became clear, but the realization hit him like ice water. Something didn't add up. The carefully documented betrayals, the meticulously traced conspiracies, they were starting to look like fragments of a story that had been pieced together with assumptions rather than facts. Reports he had trusted, people he had relied on, evidence he had filed away, they no longer fit neatly into the narrative he had spent years polishing. There were gaps. There were contradictions. And worst of all, there were questions that could not be answered with fear or intimidation. He found it first in the ledgers, the numbers that should have told one story but whispered another. Transactions that were supposed to lead to one outcome ended in another. Funds that vanished without explanation. Alliances that fractured for no reason he could trace. Every anomaly was a spark, and Jean, who had always been a man who thrived in the fire, could feel the blaze growing, fueled by doubt. Then came the rumors, the subtle ones that slid into conversations like smoke. People said things they didn't mean to, hints of movements and meetings that didn't match the histories he had recorded. The people closest to him, the ones who swore loyalty with teeth and blood, began to stumble over their words. The lies he had always counted on, the lies that cemented his legend, were starting to wobble under the weight of evidence. Jean tried to force the cracks closed, to fill the gaps with the only things he trusted, logic, power, intimidation. But no matter how hard he tried, the inconsistencies persisted. He reviewed every file, interrogated every ally, retraced every transaction. Each answer led to another question, each confession led to another secret, and every truth he uncovered seemed to point to something far larger than he had anticipated. Something that didn't fit the story he had built around himself, the story of betrayal that justified everything he had done. And then he saw her again, her face, not in person, but in the evidence he couldn't ignore. A name crossed his path, tied to deals, movements, whispers that didn't make sense. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you were looking closely, but Jean was looking closely. He traced it, followed it, dissected it like a predator circling its prey. And the deeper he went, the more impossible it became to maintain the narrative he had relied on for so long. The woman who had disappeared, the silence he had filled with assumptions, she had left traces. Traces that suggested she had never abandoned him, not in the way he imagined. She had acted, moved, and influenced things in ways that challenged the story he had told himself, the story that had justified his rise and his ruthlessness. Jin's mind raced, torn between rage and fascination. Every empire requires a foundation, and his foundation, the betrayal that had shaped him, was starting to feel like sand beneath steel. The story that had empowered him, the story that had insulated him from doubt, was cracking, and the evidence he uncovered threatened to collapse it entirely. He realized that he had been living in a narrative he constructed, not in reality. And reality, he knew, was far more dangerous. The Empire didn't feel invincible anymore. The fear he wielded, the control he thought he had, it was beginning to slip through his fingers, not because anyone had overpowered him, but because the story he believed was no longer whole. Doubt had crept in, quiet, insidious, unstoppable. And Jean, who had mastered the art of turning betrayal into power, now faced the most dangerous enemy of all, uncertainty. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the files spread across the table, at the numbers, the dates, the whispers of movements that didn't align. The cracks were everywhere, and they all pointed to one undeniable truth: the story he had told himself, the story that had built an empire, might have been a lie all along. And if that lie fell apart, everything would follow. Jean had spent years believing her silence was a betrayal, a wound carved into the edges of his empire. He had told himself she had run, abandoned him, left him to face the world alone. But the truth, when it finally revealed itself, was far more devastating, and far more brilliant, than anything he could have imagined. She hadn't disappeared because she was afraid. She had disappeared to protect him. Every shadow she left behind, every unexplained absence, every vanished moment, it had been a shield, a barrier she had built between him and a danger he didn't even know existed. Jin's pride had blinded him. He assumed that absence equaled weakness, that silence equaled cowardice. The reality was that she had been absorbing the threat alone, walking through fires he didn't even see, while he had been chasing ghosts of imagined betrayals. The evidence hit him in pieces at first. A network of transactions, meetings held in secret, threats intercepted before they reached him, threads that led directly to her. She had maneuvered in shadows, negotiating, manipulating, and confronting dangers that would have destroyed him instantly. Jean felt a cold sting of realization. Every assumption he had made about her absence, every justification he had clung to in order to harden his heart, had been wrong. It was infuriating. His empire, his control, his carefully constructed narrative of betrayal, all of it had been built on a lie, not hers, but his own. She had carried the burden of threats he hadn't known existed, of enemies he hadn't yet recognized, and she had done it in silence, ensuring that his world remained untouchable. Her absence had not been abandonment, it had been strategy, sacrifice, mastery. The more he uncovered, the more fragile his pride became. He had been angry at her for leaving, enraged by what he thought was betrayal. But now he understood that her silence had been armor, not a sword. She had absorbed the danger, fought battles he couldn't see, and kept the world at bay while he rested in the illusion of control. Jin's chest tightened with a mixture of admiration, guilt, and the kind of fury only pride can provoke when confronted with truth. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated what she was capable of, and what she had endured. And yet, the revelation was not comforting. It was a blow, a reckoning. Every risk she had taken, every calculated move in the shadows, had kept him safe, but it had also kept him blind. He had been operating under the illusion of dominance, making decisions based on incomplete truths, building his empire as if he were untouchable. And all the while, she had been the true architect of survival, quietly managing threats that would have toppled him. Jin's rage simmered, but it was different now. It was tempered by understanding, sharpened by the knowledge that her silence had been a weapon far more precise than any he could wield. He realized, in the hollow spaces of his penthouse, that the empire he so proudly claimed was, in truth, intertwined with the sacrifices she had made alone. She had been the silent storm, and he had only ever been aware of the calm afterward. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with a precision that was almost cruel. Every strange disappearance, every intercepted plot, every unexplained victory, it had her fingerprints. The danger she had faced was real, lethal, and she had faced it without complaint, without acknowledgement, without asking for credit. She had protected him not because he was powerful, but because she understood that his pride, his obsession with control, would have blinded him to the truth until it was too late. Jin's hands shook as he traced the threads, the web she had spun alone. For the first time, he felt the weight of his assumptions, the arrogance of his certainty. She had been gone, and yet she had been everywhere, moving unseen, absorbing blows he would have crumbled under, keeping the empire intact while letting him believe he had built it all himself. And now, finally, Jin understood the full cost of her silence. It was not betrayal. It was protection. It was courage. It was the kind of intelligence and foresight that no empire could survive without. He had thought he was untouchable, but in truth, he had been fragile. And it had been her silence that had kept him alive. Jin had finally seen the truth of her silence, but knowing it did not lessen the fury that churned inside him. He understood now that every move she made, every shadow she navigated, had come at a cost, one that left scars far deeper than the world would ever see. She had survived the fires alone, but survival had demanded payment in blood, in moments stolen, in pieces of herself she could never reclaim. He discovered it gradually, in the remnants of what she had left behind. Files, accounts, secret correspondences, all pointing to sacrifices no one would ever know. Resources drained, favors called in, reputations destroyed in the shadows so that his empire could remain unshakable. Jin's chest tightened as he realized what she had given, what she had traded to keep him safe, her freedom, her safety, the certainty of her own future. She had moved through his world like a ghost, absorbing threats like bullets that would have ended him instantly, leaving him to bask in the illusion of power and control. The first blow was understanding the personal toll. He saw it in the letters she had hidden, messages that hinted at missed opportunities, broken alliances, and the dreams she had shelved to protect him. Jin's empire had grown, yes, but at the expense of the woman who had kept it alive. Every victory he celebrated had been paid for with her pain. Every calculated step he took to build dominance had been supported by her courage, carried quietly, invisibly. Then came the emotional cost. She had lived in isolation, navigating enemies he didn't even know existed, bearing secrets that could have shattered him if they leaked too soon. Jin had assumed she had abandoned him because of fear, but fear was only one part of it. The real weight was the loneliness, the burden of responsibility she had shouldered alone. Nights spent planning, negotiating, surviving while the man she protected rested in ignorance, believing the world bowed to his will. She had sacrificed her heart, her peace, and perhaps even her faith in people, all for him. And finally, there was the loss of control. She had moved in shadows, yes, but those shadows were prisons in themselves. Every decision she made, every strategy she employed, was done in secrecy. She couldn't reach out, couldn't claim credit, couldn't even show weakness. Her victories were invisible, her battles, silent. Jin had lived believing he was untouchable, that his empire was proof of his mastery, but in truth, it had been her mastery that had shielded him. And that realization ignited a rage he could not quell, not at her, but at himself, at the arrogance that had blinded him for so long. He imagined what it must have cost her, friends left behind, alliances broken, threats that followed her like shadows, nights filled with terror that he could never have faced. She had been alone in a storm that would have drowned him instantly. And she had endured it without complaint, without asking for acknowledgement, without letting a single whisper reach his ears until she was ready. Jin's fingers clenched around the edge of the table as the weight of it sank in. Every instinct he had trusted, every strategy he had relied upon, every story he had told himself about betrayal and survival, it had all been incomplete. She had absorbed danger, endured pain, and sacrificed pieces of her own life so that he could continue believing in his empire. She had paid in silence, in solitude, in loss, and he had been too blind to see it until now. The fury inside him shifted, becoming something darker and sharper, a determination tempered by shame and awe. She had survived, yes, but at tremendous cost. And now that he knew, Jean understood that survival alone was not enough. The debt she had paid could not go unanswered. The risks she had taken, the battle she had fought alone, demanded recognition, demanded reckoning. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the shadows where her absence had once haunted him. The empire he had thought he controlled was only as strong as the woman who had kept it from crumbling. And while he had survived, she had lost so much more. Her life, her freedom, her peace, they were the true price of power. And Jean, for the first time, realized that the world he had fought to conquer was not his alone. It belonged to her as much as it belonged to him. Jean had always believed that power could solve everything, that with enough control, enough money, enough fear, he could bend the world to his will. But standing before her now, he realized that power had its limits. There are truths that no empire, no fortress of wealth or influence, can undo. There are consequences that cannot be bought away, threats that cannot be eliminated, and losses that no amount of strategy or manipulation can repair. He had tracked her down through shadows and whispers, tracing the subtle traces she had left behind. Every step had been a revelation, every discovery a dagger into his pride. And yet nothing had prepared him for this moment, when he finally saw her, not a ghost, not an abstraction, but a living, breathing woman whose strength and suffering eclipsed everything he had ever known. She looked at him with an intensity that mirrored his own. There was no fear, no hesitation, only a measured calm that spoke volumes. Jean had expected anger, reproach, maybe even betrayal. Instead, he was met with the quiet weight of someone who had survived alone for years, who had borne the cost of his ignorance and arrogance in silence. "I did it for you," she said softly, and the words hit him harder than any threat, any enemy, any weapon he had ever faced. It wasn't an apology, nor was it a confession, it was a declaration, simple and unyielding. She had carried the danger, endured the losses, fought the battles he didn't even know existed, all so he could continue believing in his empire. And now, standing before her, Jean understood the magnitude of what she had sacrificed. But understanding brought no relief. It brought fury, sharp and raw. Not at her, but at himself. He had been blind. He had allowed his pride to construct a narrative that ignored the truth, a story that cast her as the villain in the shadows of his mind. He had punished her with assumptions, fed his empire with lies, and believed he was untouchable while she had moved like a ghost through storms that would have destroyed him. "What did it cost you?" he demanded, the words harsher than he intended. His empire had taught him to command, to dominate, to force answers from people, but she didn't flinch. She had already borne the price, and no amount of power could make her undo it. "Everything," she said simply. "Everything I had to hold on to, everything I wanted for myself, I set it aside so you could survive. So the empire could survive. So you could believe in yourself when I couldn't let you see the truth." The weight of her words pressed down on him like stone. Jean had fought countless battles, crushed rivals, and manipulated friends and foes alike, but he had never encountered a force like this, silent, invisible, yet devastatingly real. Power could buy loyalty, fear, obedience, but it could not rewrite the past. It could not recover what she had lost, nor could it undo the years she had endured alone. He stepped closer, the instinct to command, to fix, to dominate, rising inside him. But he realized, with a bitter clarity, that no amount of force could change what had been. No deal, no threat, no empire could reclaim the sacrifices she had made. They were irreversible, permanent, etched into the lives they had both lived apart. Jin's hands clenched at his sides, trembling slightly. He had always thought control was the answer, that his story could be rewritten with the right moves, the right decisions. But now he saw that some things were outside even his reach. Power was meaningless against truth. Against loss. Against time already spent. I should have seen it, he whispered, almost to himself. I should have known. The words were not an apology, not yet. They were the first crack in the armor he had built around his ego. For the first time, Jean faced the terrifying realization that even a man who had built an empire on betrayal could not escape the consequences of misunderstanding the ones he trusted most. And she, silent, unwavering, and untouchable in her own right, had survived it all without him knowing. She had fought alone, carried danger alone, and now, in the face of his empire, in the shadow of his power, she held the one truth he could never fix: some sacrifices are beyond repayment, some losses are absolute, and some silences are louder than any empire. For the first time, Jean understood that power could not undo the past. The silence she left behind was no longer emptiness. It had become a force, a shadow that moved through Jin's empire, reshaping him, sharpening him, and haunting every decision he made. He had believed that revenge was about control, about striking back at those who had wronged him. But standing in the wake of her absence, he realized that the most dangerous revenge is not delivered, it is endured, lived, and wielded silently, shaping the one it leaves behind. Every move Jean made now was guided by the echo of what she had endured alone. Her courage, her precision, her ability to navigate threats he could not see, these were lessons etched into his mind, impossible to ignore. She had protected him without recognition, without reward, and in doing so, she had rewritten the rules of power in his world. His empire, once fueled by fear and dominance, was now infused with a respect for the quiet, calculated strength she had demonstrated. He began to see the fractures he had ignored, the enemies he had underestimated, the vulnerabilities he had dismissed. Each whisper of a rival, each shadow of a traitor, now carried the weight of her strategy. Jean moved through his empire differently, with caution tempered by understanding, with ruthlessness balanced by the knowledge of what true sacrifice demanded. Her silence had outlived her presence, and it was reshaping him in ways he could not have anticipated. The most dangerous revenge is not the kind you strike with fists or fire. It is the kind that teaches, that changes, that forces the one who believed themselves untouchable to confront the limits of their own power. Jean had lived his life believing that control equaled safety, that fear equaled loyalty. But her absence had shown him otherwise. The battles she had fought, the risks she had absorbed, the cost she had paid, these were weapons he could never wield, yet they dictated every move he made. He recalled the threats she had neutralized, the conspiracies she had dismantled, the traps she had walked through alone. Every hidden victory was a reminder of the danger he could not have survived without her. And every reminder fueled a new kind of power, a power tempered by respect, by fear of what he had once taken for granted, and by a determination to honor her legacy in the way only someone shaped by her silence could. Jin's reflection in the glass of his penthouse was sharper, harder, but different. There was still arrogance in his posture, still fire in his eyes, but there was also awareness. He could not undo the past, could not restore the moments she had lost, but he could allow her influence to guide his empire, to inform his decisions, to reshape his understanding of strength. Her revenge was quiet, invisible, and devastatingly effective. It had outlived her, and it had rewritten the man who had once believed himself untouchable. He moved through the city with a new precision, a new ruthlessness, tempered by the lessons of her sacrifice. The enemies who had once seemed formidable now appeared predictable, their weaknesses exposed by the strategies she had silently modeled for him. Every decision was sharper, every move more calculated, every response more deliberate. Jin's empire had always been formidable, but now it carried the weight of a lesson he could never forget. True power is not measured in fear or wealth, but in the courage to act, the wisdom to endure, and the strength to protect without acknowledgement. And still, the emptiness she left lingered, haunting him with its presence. He had learned that some silences are louder than any scream, and some acts of courage can outlive the person who performed them. She had reshaped him entirely, forced him to confront his arrogance, his pride, his assumptions. And in doing so, she had delivered the most dangerous revenge imaginable, not destruction, but transformation. Jean smiled then, a slow, dangerous smile. The empire remained his, but he was no longer the man he had been. He carried her lessons like weapons, her sacrifices like armor, her silence like a constant reminder that power is never absolute, and the price of survival is sometimes paid by someone else entirely. And as the city stretched beneath him, alive with opportunity and threat, Jean understood one unshakable truth: her silence would continue to outlive her, guiding him, reshaping him, and ensuring that vengeance, when delivered with patience and precision, could be far more dangerous than fire or steel. She had disappeared, yes, but in doing so, she had become immortal in the empire she had saved and the man she had forged. Please don't forget to subscribe and like if you enjoyed this story.